Well, today we come to 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 13. We got to be careful before we dive into this section that we don't just pull it out of context. I love that we get to study this whole book this summer and walk through it together, because you'll remember that where we landed last week was Barrett talking about this new identity that God has given us as a people of God together. And Peter says, now that you know who you are individually and who you now are as a people, I want you to keep your conduct among the Gentiles honorable, so that when they see you, their objections are actually silenced. I want you to live in such a way that shouts the gospel. And so the passage that we're going to talk about today is really just double clicking on that idea. What does it mean in all these different areas for us to live out the truths of the gospel, the realities of our identity becoming evident in our conduct? And he's going to talk about 4 different areas. The first one being society, or the way we interact with our government. The second one kind of being the workplace. The third, our home life. And then one that's just beyond where we're going to go today, but where you'll go next week, is within the church. All of them have to do with this word submission, which makes people in our society freak out a little bit. We're Westerners, it's 2022, and someone else's authority over us, or someone hampering our freedom, seems to be the worst possible scenario we could have. But I think that's only because biblical submission has been misunderstood. This word, be subject for the Lord's sake to every human institution, how he starts verse 13. This word, be subject, has like a military connotation to it. It has to do with formation, forming in an orderly fashion underneath a head commander. It's a getting in line. It communicates a willingness to submit our needs and wants to the needs of another, which sounds very similar, doesn't it, to the great commandment. This is all about living out the truth of our identity in very earthy ways. And he says, listen, I want you to honor the emperor. And I want you to honor him because you are free. You're free, and in fact, you're so free that you can be a servant of others. It reminded me of that show, Undercover Boss. Have y'all seen this? Where the heads of restaurant franchises or large companies go undercover, and they'll work in the lowest of the totem pole of positions in their company to experience what it's like. When they experience mistreatment there, they don't have to buck up or get upset, because they know who they are. And in fact, they know that they have power, authority, and influence to change those places of mistreatment. It's very much the same with us. So he says, listen, you are exiles. This is not your homeland, but while you're here, go ahead and honor the emperor, because we're going to put to silence their foolish ignorance by doing the will of God with good conduct. Then he moves on to servants. He's talking about an indentured servanthood of sorts. Some translations might say slaves, and he's describing a work environment. And he's saying, listen, I know that sometimes you might be mistreated, but when you're there, because you know who you are, whose you are, and where you're going, you can endure mistreatment. And in fact, you can do that because Christ has done so in an ultimate sense for you. And then we come to this most beautiful expression of the gospel in 1 Peter. In fact, it is so wonderful that I hope you'll commit it to memory with me this week. But Peter says that he, speaking of Jesus, himself bore our sins in his body on the tree, that we might die to sins and live for righteousness. It's by his wounds that you have been healed. He's saying not only did Jesus give you an example to follow in suffering unjustly, but he bore all the weight of injustice. And he has provided all the healing that you need so that you can walk through this life as exiles in submission where God has called you to do so. And then he makes the most incredible statement. He says that you have once strayed off like sheep, but now you've returned to the shepherd and overseer of your souls. This is so worth committing to memory. It's the hinge point of this entire section of his argument about how we should conduct ourselves as elect exiles in society, in the workplace, in our homes, and in the church, because he's saying this: just as Jesus did, we can entrust ourselves to the one who judges justly. The government is not ultimately in charge of my well-being. The government does not shepherd me. My boss is not the overseer of my soul. My husband is not the overseer of my soul, or your wife. It's Jesus Christ himself. And he's already laid down his life for you. He will be a just judge and carer for your soul. And because that's true, we can live in submission to other people for the glory of God and for the sake of Christ. He moves on to the home. And notice that he's speaking here not just to women being in subjection to men. He's speaking to women being subject to their own husbands. And he's actually speaking to a really specific scenario here. He's speaking to women who would be new converts to Christianity and their husbands are unbelievers. He says, listen, I know you might tend to be tempted to use lots of words to win him over, or maybe even tempted to manipulate him with your beauty. He said, let me call you to something deeper than that. I want to call you to conduct that is respectful and pure toward the Lord. The Greek there actually indicates that he means respectful and pure conduct unto God. And that when the unbelieving husband sees that, he'll be won over without words to the Lord himself. And he says, listen, you're going to do this. You're going to adorn yourself by hoping in God. You're not hoping in your husband. You're not hoping in your ability to control his spiritual life. You're going to hope in God, and that's going to adorn you. Just as a side note, by the way, ladies, he's not forbidding jewelry, okay? He's not forbidding you doing your hair or makeup. And you know the reason why I know that is because when we read closely, we see that he says, do not let your adorning be external, the braiding of hair, the putting on of gold jewelry, or the clothing you wear. He's certainly not forbidding clothing. He's giving those as an example, saying we're not going for external adornment, we're going for internal adornment, and that comes from hoping in God. And when you hope in God, you don't chiefly fear your husband. You're set free and you are courageous, even in the face of living with an unbelieving husband, because you obey God and trust him. Lastly, he said, husbands, I want you to live with your wives in an understanding way. When he speaks of the woman as a weaker vessel, this word vessel is the same that we see used in passages like Paul calling us to be jars of clay. This is speaking of the body. Often, not always, but often women are weaker physically than men. And he's saying, men, you might tend toward force as a use of manipulation with your husbands. And I'm saying, I want you to be honoring and understanding with them. And he makes this radical statement, particularly for a patriarchal society that he would have been speaking into. He said, I want you to do that because they're heirs with you, alongside you, to the grace of life. You are fellow heirs. She is completely equal with you in status. And so I want you to honor her. I want you to honor her. And he says, really seriously, men, I want you to honor her so that your prayers are not hindered, so that nothing comes in between you and the Lord in the way you mistreat your wife. At the end of the day, this is a picture of, I want you to live out your identity as a people of God, you have this transcendent reality that you're exiles here. You belong to a heavenly kingdom. But here's how you conduct yourself in the here and now for the Lord's sake, that He might receive glory and you might receive joy.